but I may as well have talked to a stump, for all the attention he paid to me. He kept walking around sniffing here and there. He couldn't understand why we were waiting. He was wanting to hunt. Rubin and Rainie showed up just at dark. Both had sneers on their faces. "You ready?" Rubin asked. "Yes," I said, and asked him which way was the best to go. "Let's go down river away and work up," he said. "We're sure to strike him coming up river, and that way we've got the wind in our favor." "Are these the hounds that we've been hearing so much about?" Rainie asked. I nodded. "They look too little to be any good," he said. I told him dynamite came in little packages. He asked me if I had my $2. "Yes," I said. He wanted to see the money. I showed it to him. Rubin, not to be outdone, showed me his. We crossed an old field and entered the river bottoms. By this time it was quite dark. I lit my lantern and asked which one wanted to carry my axe. "It's yours," Rainie said. "You carry it." Not wanting to argue, I carried both the lantern and the axe. Rainie started telling me how stingy and crooked my grandfather was. I told him I hadn't come to have any trouble or to fight. All I wanted to do was hunt the ghost coon. If there was going to be any trouble, I would just call my dogs and go home. Rubin had a nickel's worth of sense, but Rainie had none at all. Rubin told him if he didn't shut up, he was going to bloody his nose. That shut Rainie up. Old Dan opened up first. It was a beautiful thing to hear. The deep tones of his voice rolled in the silent night. A bird in a canebrake on our right started chirping. A big swamp rabbit came running down the riverbank as if all hell was close to his heels. A bunch of mallards, feeding in the shallows across the river, took flight with frightened quacks. A feeling that only a hunter knows slowly crept over my body. I whooped my dogs, urging them on. Little Anne came in. Her bell-like tones blended with old Dan's imperfect rhythm. We stood and listened to the beautiful music, the deep-throated notes of hunting hounds on the hot-scented trail of a river coon. Rubin said, "If he crosses the river up at the Buck Ford, it's the ghost coon. It's the way he always runs." We stood and listened. Sure enough, the voices of my dogs were silent for a few minutes. Old Dan, a more powerful swimmer than Little Ann, was the first to open up after crossing over. She was close behind him. Rubin said, "That's him, all right. That's the ghost coon." We crossed the river. They crossed the river again. We waited. Rainie said, "You may as well get your money out now." I told him just to wait a while, and I'd show him the ghost coon's hide. This brought a loud laugh from Rainie, which sounded like someone had dropped an empty bucket on a gravel bar and then had kicked it. The wily old coon crossed the river several times, but couldn't shake my dogs from his trail. He cut out from the bottoms, walked a rail fence, and jumped from it into a thick canebrake. He piled into an old slough. Where it emptied into the river, he swam to the middle. Doing opposite to what most coons do, which was swim downstream, he swam upstream. He stopped at an old drift in the middle of it. Little Ann found him. When she jumped from the drift, old Dan was far down river, searching for the trail. If he could have gotten her in time, it would have been the last of the ghost coon. But Little Ann couldn't do much by herself in the water. He fought his way free from her, swam to our side, and ran upstream. I could hear old Dan coming through the bottoms on the other side, bawling at every jump. I could feel the driving power in his voice. We heard him when he hit the water to cross over. It sounded like a cow had jumped in. Little Ann was warming up the ghost coon. I could tell by her voice that she was close to him. Reaching our side, old Dan tore out after her. He was a mad hound. His deep voice was telling her he was coming. We were trotting along, following my dogs, when I heard Little Ann's bawling stop. "Wait a minute," I said. "I think she has treed him. Let's give her time to circle the tree to make sure he's there." Old Dan started bawling up opened up bawling treed. Reuben started on. Something's wrong, I said. I can't hear little Ann. Rainie spoke up. Maybe the ghost coon ate her up. I glared at him. Hurrying on, we came to my dogs. Old Dan was bawling at a hole in a large sycamore that had fallen into the river. At that spot, the bank was a good 10 feet above the water level. As the big tree had fallen, the roots had been torn and twisted from the ground. The jagged roots, acting as a drag, had stopped it from falling all the way into the stream. The trunk lay on a steep slant from the top of the bank into the water. Looking down, I could see the broken, tangled mass of the top. Debris from floods had caught in the limbs, forming a drift. Old Dan was trying to dig and gnaw his way into the log. Pulling him from the hole, I held my lantern up and looked down into the dark hollow. I knew that somewhere down below the surface there had to be another hole in the trunk, as water had filled the hollow to the river below. Reuben, looking over my shoulder, said, That coon couldn't be in there. If he was, he'd be drowned. I agreed. Rainie spoke up. You ready to pay off, he asked. I told you them hounds couldn't tree the ghost coon. I told him the show wasn't over. Little Ann had never bawled treed, and I knew she wouldn't until she knew exactly where the coon was. Working the bank up and down, and not finding the trail, she swam across the river and worked the other side. For a good half hour she searched that side before she came back across to where old Dan was. She sniffed out round the hollow log. We might as well get away from here, Rainie said. I ain't going to find the ghost coon. Sure looks that way, Reuben said. I told them I wasn't giving up until my dogs did. You just want to be stubborn, Reuben said. I'm ready for the money now. I asked him to wait a few minutes. Ain't no use, he said. No hound yet ever treed that coon hound. Hearing a whine, I turned around. Little Ann had crawled up on the log and was inching her way down the slick trunk towards the water. I held my lantern up so I could see better. Spraddle-legged, claws digging into the bark, she was easing her way down. You better get her out of there, Reuben said. She gets down that old tree stump, she'll drown. Reuben didn't know my little Ann. Once her feet slipped, I saw her hindquarters fall off to one side. She didn't get scared. She slowly eased her legs back up on the log. I made no reply. I just watched and waited. Little Ann eased herself into the water. Swimming to the drift, she started sniffing around. In places it was thin and her legs would break through. Climbing, clawing, and swimming, she searched the drift over, looking for the lost trail. When I saw when she stopped searching. With her body half in the water and her front feet curved over a piece of driftwood, she turned her head and looked towards the shore. I could see her head twisting from side to side. I could tell by her actions that she had gotten the scent. With a low whine, she started back. I told Reuben, I think she smells something. Slowly and carefully she worked her way through the tangled mass. I lost sight of her when she came close to the undermined bank. She wormed her way under the overhang. I could hear her clawing and wallowing around. And then all hell broke loose. Out from under the bank came the biggest coon I had ever seen. The ghost coon. He came out right over little Ann. She caught him in the old treetop. I knew she was no match for him in that tangled mass of limbs and logs. He fought his way free and swam for the opposite bank. She was right behind him. Old Dan didn't wait, look, or listen. He piled off the 10-foot bank and disappeared from sight. I looked for him. I knew he was tangled in the debris under the surface. I started to take off my overalls, but stopped when I saw his red head shoot up out of the water. Bawling and crawling his way free of the limbs and logs, he was on his way. On reaching midstream, the ghost coon headed downriver with little Ann still on his trail. We ran down the riverbank. I could see my dogs clearly in the moonlight. The ghost coon was about 15 feet ahead of little Ann. About 25 yards behind them came old Dan, trying so hard to catch up. I whooped to them. Reuben grabbed a pole, saying, "He may come out on this side." Knowing the ghost coon was desperate, I wondered what he would do. Reaching a gravel bar below the high bank, we ran out on it to the water's edge. The ghost coon did something that I never expected. Coming even with us, he turned from the midstream and came straight for us. I heard Reuben yell, "Here he comes!" He turned his way through the shallows and ran right between us. Reuben swung his pole, missed the coon, and almost hit little Ann. The coon headed for the river bottoms with her right on his heels. The bawling of little Ann and our screaming and hollering made so much noise I didn't hear old Dan coming. He tore out of the river, plowed into me, and knocked me down. We ran through the bottoms, following my dogs. I thought the ghost coon was going back to the sycamore log, but he didn't. He ran upriver. We were hurrying after him. While hurrying after them, I looked over at Rainie. For once in his life, I think he was excited. He was whooping and screaming and falling over log rims. It felt good all over. Glancing it over at me, Rainie said, "They ain't got him yet." Glancing over at me, the ghost coon crossed the river time after time. Seeing that he couldn't shake old Dan and little Ann from his trail, he cut through the river bottoms and ran out onto an old field. At this maneuver, Reuben said to Rainie, "He's heading for that tree." "What tree?" I asked. "You'll see," Rainie said. "When he gets tired, he always heads for the tree. That's where he gets his name, the ghost coon. He just disappears." "If he disappears, here's my dogs will disappear with him," I said. Rainie laughed. I had to admit one thing. The Pritchard boys knew the habits of the ghost coon. I knew he couldn't run all night. He had already far surpassed any coon I had ever chased. "They're just about there," Reuben said. Just when I heard old Dan bark treed. Just then I heard old Dan bark treed. I waited for little Ann's voice. I didn't hear her. I wondered what it could be this time. "He's there all right," Reuben said. "He's in that tree." "Well, come on," I said. "I want to see that tree." "You might as well get your money out," Rainie said. I told him he had said that once before. Back on the river bank. To be continued.